Will the U.S. allow South Korea and Japan to be nuclear armed? 3. North Korean denuclearization scenario. Making the miracle on the Taedong River. North Korean Workers' Party can give up nuclear weapons. The so-called balance of terror, counterintuitive idea of pressuring China and Russia by allowing South Korea and Japan to develop their own nuclear weapons is a highly interesting and unconventional strategy that is intermittently raised in the field of international relations and within some sectors of U.S. politics, particularly by some hawkish figures in the Trump camp. In fact, one of the scenarios China fears most is the nuclear armament of South Korea and Japan. In other words, the Northeast Asia nuclear domino effect. The core logic of this strategy is clear. It creates a flow where the U.S. declares permission for South Korea and Japan to arm themselves with nuclear weapons for China. Japan's possession of nuclear weapons becomes the worst security nightmare for Russia. The Northeast Asia nuclear domino effect causes the collapse of its strategic environment. China and Russia pressure North Korea to really give up its nuclear weapons now, and negotiations on North Korea's denuclearization resume. There are also historical precedents. Nixon's establishment of diplomatic relations with China was a counterintuitive move intended to pressure the Soviet Union, and Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI) was a strategy that induced an arms race the Soviet Union could not handle, thereby forcing them into negotiations. This idea is an extension of that lineage. What China fears most is Japan's nuclear armament. If China were to rank its security nightmares, Japan's possession of nuclear weapons would rank at the very top, alongside Taiwan's independence. Why Japan? It is due to the historical trauma of World War II and national sentiment. With Japan's technological capabilities, it is possible to manufacture nuclear weapons within 6 to 12 months. It possesses a plutonium stockpile of approximately 46 tons and has rocket technology. If Japan acquires nuclear weapons, China's regional dominance based on nuclear monopoly would collapse. If South Korea also acquires them, China would be placed in a three-sided nuclear encirclement. From Xi Jinping's perspective, if the equation condoning North Korea's nuclear weapons resulted in Japan's nuclear weapons holds true, the cost-benefit calculations for pressuring North Korea would be fundamentally overturned. What about Russia's calculations? Russia also does not want Japan to be nuclear armed. There is the dispute over the Northern Territory's Kuril Islands, and the Russian Far East would come within range. However, since Russia is currently tied down by its dealings with Ukraine, the intensity of its reaction may be weaker than China's. 2. The actual operating mechanism of this strategy is quite interesting. A pressure effect is generated merely by a declaration. In reality, South Korea and Japan do not even need to build nuclear weapons. From the moment the United States declares that it is considering allowing exceptions to the NPT, China's diplomatic actions change. Step 1. The United States officially declares that it will reconsider its policy prohibiting South Korea and Japan from arming themselves with nuclear weapons unless North Korea denuclearizes. Step 2. China responds immediately through diplomatic means, beginning to play the card of pressure against North Korea. Step 3. A space for negotiation is established, and a big deal is struck between the U.S. and China involving North Korean denuclearization versus the abandonment of nuclear armament by South Korea and Japan. Step 4. A structure is completed in which China exerts substantial pressure on North Korea. This is a structure where leverage is generated not through permission, but solely through the threat of permission. This is the possibility of designing an actual negotiation package. The United States guarantees the continued non-armament of South Korea and Japan, and China suspends energy and food supplies to North Korea. The United States reaffirms the status quo regarding Taiwan, and China re-implements UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea. If the United States discusses adjusting the nature of U.S. forces Korea, China jointly designs a roadmap for North Korean denuclearization. 3. However, this strategy faces greater obstacles in reality. The logic is strong, but there are structural barriers to implementation. The issue of the collapse of the NPT regime. The moment the United States allows South Korea and Japan to arm themselves with nuclear weapons, whether officially or implicitly, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT), which the U.S. has led for the past 50 years, will effectively collapse completely. This leads to a loss of control over allies, one of the core mechanisms by which the United States maintains its status as a global superpower is to bind their security and foreign policy within the U.S. framework in exchange for providing a nuclear umbrella. If South Korea and Japan acquire independent nuclear weapons, they will no longer need to rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and thus U.S. control over East Asia will weaken rapidly. This raises the possibility of a global nuclear domino effect. If the United States allows South Korea and Japan to possess nuclear weapons, arguing that they are good allies, all pro- and anti-American nations around the world, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Taiwan, and Australia, will simultaneously justify their own nuclear armament. As a result, Saudi Arabia will immediately declare nuclear development under the pretext of responding to Iran, and Iran will gain justification to accelerate its nuclear development. Turkey, Egypt, and the UAE will follow suit, embarking on the development of their nuclear potential. As this spreads into a global nuclear domino effect, the non-proliferation regime built by the United States over decades will completely collapse. The United States most fears nuclear anarchy, where the world splits into dozens of nuclear-armed states. This is the primary reason for the opposition from the U.S. State Department and security agencies. It is a paradox where attempting to contain North Korea triggers global nuclear proliferation. The reality of Japan's domestic politics is also far from easy. Japan is the world's only country to have suffered nuclear attacks. There is Article 9 of the Constitution and the 3 non-nuclear principles prohibition of possession, manufacture, and import, and public sentiment supporting nuclear armament remains in the minority. Even within the Liberal Democratic Party, discussions on possessing nuclear weapons are practically taboo. Even if the United States were to grant permission, it would take a considerable amount of time for Japanese politics to accept it. South Korea takes time to develop nuclear weapons. South Korea's enrichment and reprocessing capabilities are restricted by the ROC-U.S. Atomic Energy Agreement. It will take at least 3 to 5 years to develop nuclear weapons independently, and realistically, it will take even longer without technical cooperation from the United States. Substantive preparation is required to ensure the credibility of such threats. It is also unclear whether China will capitulate at the edge of a cliff. China is extremely reluctant to set a precedent of yielding to U.S. pressure. The perception that it surrendered to intimidation is fatal to Xi Jinping's domestic politics. Instead, it could respond with a reverse threat, stating that it will take a hardline stance on the Taiwan issue if nuclear armament is permitted. In the worst-case scenario, there is a risk that China and Russia will choose preemptive strikes instead of pressure. If the United States signals that it will allow South Korea and Japan to arm themselves with nuclear weapons, condoning withdrawal from the NPT and providing technical assistance, China and Russia might become frightened and pressure North Korea. However, the risk of the situation spiraling out of control is far greater. This is a reenactment of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just as the U.S. was willing to go to war when Soviet nuclear missiles attempted to enter its doorstep in the past, China and Russia will certainly not sit idly by while nuclear-armed South Korea and Japan appear right next to their borders. There is the possibility of a preemptive strike. It takes at least several months to 1 or 2 years for South Korea and Japan to reprocess nuclear materials and complete operational nuclear weapons. China, Russia, and North Korea face a strong temptation to launch preemptive military strikes against nuclear manufacturing facilities or key military strongholds before South Korea and Japan complete their nuclear weapons. It is a dangerous gamble where a nuclear war could break out on the Korean peninsula first while attempting to apply pressure. The discrepancy between Trump's calculations and reality is also a problem. Paradoxically, for Trump, the nuclear armament of allies may appear attractive in the short term because he can link it to the logic of withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea. However, realists around Trump, such as Rubio, are well aware of the repercussions of the collapse of the NPT and are highly likely to put the brakes on actual implementation. Therefore, the most realistic variant model is the nuclear sharing model. Instead of allowing full nuclear armament, a Northeast Asian version of the NATO-style nuclear sharing model is a more realistic intermediate path. NATO nuclear sharing involves deploying U.S. tactical nuclear weapons to Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Turkey, and training and certifying their delivery capabilities for fighter jets. While the United States retains ownership of the nuclear weapons, allies participate in the decision-making process for their use. When applied to Northeast Asia, tactical nuclear weapons would be redeployed to South Korea, returning them after the 1991 withdrawal, and a South Korea-U.S. nuclear sharing consultative body would be established. Japan would be reviewed in a second stage due to political reasons. The advantages of this model are that it does not violate the NPT maintaining U.S. ownership, sufficiently conveys a signal of pressure on China, can absorb public opinion in South Korea favoring nuclear armament, and is fast to implement. In fact, the formation of the Nuclear Consultative Group NCG was agreed upon in the 2023-2024 South Korea-U.S. Washington Declaration, marking a step already taken in this direction. Strengthening this further or upgrading it to the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons is a realistic option in Trump's second term. The conditions under which this strategy works are when the United States is willing to make sacrifices regarding parts of the NPT regime, when China perceives Japan's nuclear armament as a worse outcome than North Korea's nuclear program, and when Japanese domestic politics are capable of accepting nuclear discussions. This is the sequence of the most realistic implementation path. Step 1. Redeploy tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea and strengthen the nuclear sharing consultative body. This signals to China that this is just the beginning. Step 2. The United States sends an unofficial signal that it is reconsidering its policy of prohibiting Japan from acquiring nuclear weapons. Observe the reaction through Chinese diplomatic channels. Step 3. Verify whether China changes its pressure tactics against North Korea. If there is no change, further elevate South Korea-Japan nuclear sharing. Step 4. If China moves, execute a big deal in which progress on North Korean denuclearization is used to freeze South Korea and Japan's nuclear capabilities. In conclusion, this strategy possesses the most logically powerful leverage structure. It is efficient in that the United States does not bear the direct costs, but rather leverages China's security fears to make China act on its own initiative. However, the core dilemma of implementation is the structural contradiction that, for a threat to be credible, there must be a will to actually act, and doing so would cause the NPT regime to collapse. Therefore, the most realistic solution is not to allow full nuclear armament, but to continuously send signals to China that there is a next step through the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons and the strengthening of nuclear sharing. This alone could exert significant pressure to change China's calculations regarding North Korea. 5. Another realistic compromise proposed by the United States is supporting quasi-nuclear armament. As the burden on the United States grows due to the advancement of North Korea's nuclear program and China's expansion, U.S. strategy has recently shifted from directly allowing nuclear armament to a method of fostering the capability potential to reach the threshold of nuclear weapons. In fact, looking at recent developments, such as the Gyeongju summit between the Trump administration and the South Korean government scheduled for October 2025, the United States is playing the following cards to prevent its allies from making the extreme choice of independent nuclear armament while simultaneously pressuring China and Russia. This approach involves revising the Nuclear Cooperation Agreement and allowing submarines to expand South Korea's authority for independent uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing, as well as officially approving the development of nuclear-powered attack submarines, SSNs. It is a strategy to send an indirect warning to China and Russia that if you do not contain North Korea, the nuclear potential of South Korea and Japan will continue to grow. By strengthening a system for permanently deploying or jointly planning and operating U.S. nuclear weapons around the Korean Peninsula, similar to NATO-style nuclear sharing, through the advancement of nuclear sharing. 5. In summary, it is clear that allowing South Korea and Japan to arm themselves with nuclear weapons is the most powerful leverage capable of grabbing China and Russia by the throat and shaking them. However, from the U.S. perspective, in return, it must shoulder massive risks, accepting the risk of all-out war on the Korean Peninsula, losing global nuclear control, and weakening control over its key allies, South Korea and Japan. Therefore, rather than crossing the red line of allowing direct nuclear armament, the United States has no choice but to prefer a controlled pain strategy that indirectly pressures China and Russia by building up the military capabilities of South Korea and Japan to the pre-nuclear stage reprocessing, nuclear submarines, etc. Next time, we will discuss a scenario for North Korean denuclearization through the guarantee of permanent neutrality of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.